Okay. All right, we'll call the meeting to order. We have Vince Murphy from the town attending. We have Fritz McClure, Ian Golding, Matt Fee, Mary Longacre, Jen Carberg, and Sarah Trainer-Boyce for the committee. And please silence your cell phones, computers, other devices, and also make sure your mic is turned on for the meeting. We have Peter Brace joining us, and Gary Beller on the telephone. Sorry, didn't mean to forget you there, Gary.
Okay.
All right, the meeting is being audio and video recorded. And the first item, I don't think we have the the minutes from the 13th. No, so we'll skip that and note that's the 13th, not the 12th on the agenda, if I'm correct. Am I right, or is it? So it was the 13th or the 12th? I'm sorry, Vince. It was the 12th, sorry. I'll correct myself. The first item on our agenda then is to review the committee's goals, which were developed almost 6 months ago. This marks our 6 months existence as a committee with the last meeting in February. And so both Vince and I thought that we want to take a look at those goals and see if there's progress, if there's something we want to change about them, add to them, anything else we want to discuss about them. So Vince, I think you're going to pull those up as soon as you get, okay. Yeah.
Can I make a really quick comment?
Sure.
Just an observation. So I missed the second half of the meeting last week, so I watched it online. And I noticed that the mics that are the really small ones, like this one and Vince's, unless you're right on it, you can't hear it. So most of what you were saying, Vince, I couldn't hear you when I listened to the video recording. I've noticed talking into that one, it doesn't sound like it picks up unless you're literally practically touching it. So I just figured I'd say that. So that.
Good to know.
And I agree. I listened to it also because I wasn't at the meeting. And similarly, there were I didn't realize it was the size of the mic, but there were certain people you could not hear at all. And I kept turning it up. Turning it up.
Yeah. And then, I've noticed it watching other meetings. I just wanted to bring it to attention so that.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Sarah. Now we all know.
That's why you have scientists. We've been trying to figure out why some people can't be heard. I didn't know.
It's something with the small mic. I don't know.
It's the size of the sand grains. Here we go.
We collect the data, bring it back.
Studied it for the night. I'm like, okay.
I watched the select board meeting to see if it was the same, correlating data.
Right, ready, Vince? No?
It's still going.
Oh.
Technology.
Does anybody have with them our goals?
No.
I didn't bring my file. Sorry.
Oh, look, discussion of main goals for the committee back on October 1st. Stakeholders list, education goals, monitoring program, library of resources. Those were the items on the agenda on October 1st.
We just put check marks next to all of them.
Good progress.
So briefly, we did develop a stakeholders list, but we had also discussed reaching out to those stakeholders. I don't think we've done anything in that realm yet.
Can I say something about stakeholders? So I was at a completely different meeting on Friday, and but it was a similar discussion of stakeholders in that topic. And one thing that I thought was interesting that could be pertinent to this group too is, and I can't remember if we did this in October, but with the stakeholder group, decide because everyone in the community is a stakeholder. We sort of said that is identify when certain stakeholders should have more input than others. So there's like the there's obviously when the consultants are developing the plan, there's going to be a lot of public outreach for input, and that would be all stakeholders. And then, at what stage are certain stakeholders more or less involved? Obviously, anyone can be involved when they want to and come to our meetings and things like that. But in terms of that list that we made and really targeting the groups for particular targets, I didn't know if that made sense to think about we can talk more later about the education committee, but maybe there's certain groups that would benefit more from the output of that kind of work versus, I'm just throwing it out there as ways to not whittle the stakeholders down, but target certain stakeholder groups more pointedly.
Well, that's a good example would be downtown businesses like Harvey Young dealing with that and having, I think, different platforms for them to have input would be a very good idea.
Okay, any other thoughts?
I like what Sarah just said for sure, thinking about our stakeholders. I know we're still getting to what our goals are going to be going forward, but if there are particular stakeholder groups we're going to want to reach in the summer as well, figuring out a timing piece with the education, what's coming out of the education committee and how and when we're going to reach particular groups might be part of that discussion.
I can give an update at some point about the education committee, but I think there's going to be different types of things that come out of it that are kind of geared towards different stakeholders.
Okay.
Oh, and Herbert Avenue is another good example. They're nearly all summer residents, and I'm sure they have a lot to say.
Yes, I am sure, as they should.
All right, well, Sarah, the second goal was education goals. Do you want to give us an update on the education subcommittee?
Yeah, so we met, I don't know I forget the exact date, but a little over a week ago, maybe almost 2 weeks ago, and we just kind of hit the ground running with talking about the different types of things that we might want to be able to put out. And just wanted to start, even though we identified there's lots of different materials that we looked at from other communities that we can share fully with this group, but it was other communities who've either had grant money or already have hit the ground running like years ago, so that why reinvent the wheel? We can tailor what other communities have done to our needs. So that was kind of the first initial discussion, and then we decided the very first thing to make a sort of flyer brochure that is going to be geared towards homeowners. Some of the information will definitely be pertain to renters, but it's mostly geared towards people who can change their property or interested in working with their property. And so we've taken it's in a draft stage, so we're not ready to present to this group. We kind of thought once it's more put together, we'll present it as a draft to this group for approval. It was the plan, but it's based on some infographics from both. There was one from somewhere in the UK, I can't remember, and then for FEMA regulations, where it's basically a picture of a house and different things you can do. So it's different levels of things like, from some of it from the point of building a home, where you want to put your infrastructure within the house, you might want to put on the second floor or higher up, to ways you can alter landscaping and things in your yard, and suggestions like that. So I don't have the information in front of me to share with you all, but I think it's kind of a way that we can be doing things and moving forward while waiting for the next stages of the with the RFP going out and all that. It's going to be some time, so I think that's where we were happy to kind of be moving forward. So that's kind of the inside will be more of that direct information for homeowners, and then on the thinking it's going to be foldable on the other parts of the brochure would be information about this committee, how people can get involved, and some resources. So recognizing that this is just one thing and there's a plan to put out more things, that we wanted to make it simple and clean, and then also be in line with the town's Vince, the
branding.
The branding,
Act
thank
local.
you. The Act Local, thank you. So that's kind of where we are at with that. And we have not set a second meeting just yet. We are going to be doing a little bit behind the scenes before we met again. Vince, I know you're working on stuff, so I don't know if you heard everything I said, but do you have anything to fill in from Education Committee that I may have missed?
No, it seems like the Education Committee is coming along. I think at some point later we'll just have to set a date for the third meeting. Other than that, it's doing very, very well.
All right, thank you. Next one was our monitoring program. Vince had talked about establishing a shoreline measurement program. Vince, do you have anything that you need to update us on that?
Yeah, that effectively stalled. Equipment from the water company, I just have to chase up. I'm also questioning the necessity for it anymore. That's where it really is at. I have found such good information from CZM, I don't see the necessity anymore.
Okay, thank you. And then our library of resources, which is online and being added to on a regular basis, I
Yes.
guess. Yeah.
That is every once in a while. Once we have presentations, I try and collect them. I send them along. And try and get. I then have to just do a little bit of chasing sometimes, just to make sure things get posted and get updated. But it does happen eventually, and the library is coming along.
I can't hear what you're saying, and I think nobody on the TV is going to hear what you're saying when they replay it because you're too far from the mic or the mic isn't working or something.
So he's got one of the little tiny mics, Gary, and it is definitely an issue with the mic. He's right up on it.
Just trade them out.
All right. Apparently, myself and
Oh, that's much better. Vince.
Fritz are going to share.
Yeah.
There you go.
But effectively, yes. The library is in full effect and getting larger all the time. One of the things that I've been kind of curious about the library is putting a directory into it because it's getting a little large. There is one, I have it. Getting it put up there now is the next, and making it usable, user-friendly is kind of my main problem with the library at the moment.
Right.
Is there a problem because it's of the size of it, or is it just the searchability of it?
Yeah, there is no real searchability. So at the moment, it's just lists of PDFs. There's about 55, 56 different documents in there at the moment. That doesn't count presentations. That's just background information. And it's all mixed in together. There's no true order to it is part of my problem.
I don't know what the town's website abilities are, but is it possible to make something collapsible, like have different headings of Nantucket specific educational resources, background literature, I don't know. Just, you could pick the headings, but
well, yeah, let's
possible.
the way that it currently is, just to kind of outline it for those who may not have seen it recently, is it's kind of a name of a PDF that's a link that you can click on, and then underneath it has a description of what it contains. But if we could in fact use some parts of the RFP as a guide, because we've also included a lot of background information from the RFP in it. Now, the library contains a lot more than that. But what we could do, I like your suggestions here, is make it into parts that are Nantucket specific, like town developed plans. Then have a separate section of scientific research that yourself, Jen, Mark Borelli, etc., have been involved in. That could be a very useful section unto itself. Then the only other distinct section in it at the moment is the plans from other communities. There are 6 plans up there at the moment from other towns. That could be another way to try and see if we can differentiate some more.
Yeah, and even like the presentations that we have recorded, or even like the links to other presentations from other boards or something, that could be another section. Right, I think there were... Yeah.
So separate to that, outside of the library, on the committee's webpage, there's a link to the minutes, and there's also a link to the YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. Could I incorporate that into the library is another question.
Probably not necessary,
Yeah,
I guess.
they're only one page apart. And just for the public's benefit, we have a shortcut to be able to find the library. If you go to resilientac.org, there's a link on there to the library. So you don't have to dig through the town's website quite so much. Okay, any other discussion of the goals that we had set 5 months ago? Any ideas for goals that we should update or add new goals? And I think Vince and I sort of imagined that we'd give you 2 weeks to think about that if you want to come back at the next meeting with any other suggestions for goals. It's not a requirement that we have them, but it's helpful to have something guiding us, especially since we've gotten through the RFP process and we've received the climate strategies document back. Those were two big events that we were waiting for 5 months ago, and have dealt with, at least in some measure, and will continue to deal with, but they won't be the overriding focus of the committee in the next couple of months, I imagine.
I would also like to invite people to give names and suggestions of other people who could come to speak at various points. It was originally a goal at one point. I was supposed to generate that list, and I have been working on it kind of in a piecemeal fashion as names were suggested. I've added to them to the list. One of the few that's come out of it that will be happening is Tom O'Shea, who's coming March 17th.
And that's trustees of reservations to talk about their resilience plan for Code 2. Okay, anyone else?
What's the time?
I'm sorry, Jen. Go ahead, Gary.
It was referred to before, but I'd like to reemphasize the point that when we're looking for stakeholder feedback or community feedback, it's very important that we recognize that a large part of our population, the population that pays for most of the expenses on the island, are not here off season, they're in the season. And I think it's important for us to understand that if we're trying to get good feedback, we need, from especially the people that are only seasonal, we need to schedule that between June and September, and not February or November, which is what the town does all the time. Drives me crazy when I see they're asking for comments about whether you need paid parking when nobody who uses paid parking is sitting in the audience because all the seasonal people are not there. So if we're going to get feedback properly from the seasonal community, we have to do it during the season. That's my comment.
I take your point, Gary, but I would point out that anybody can send written comments. They can call to express their comments to town employees. There's certainly no limit on having to be present physically in order to provide feedback. Jen, you were going to go ahead with something.
Well, first, I think Gary is just reiterating what I had also said earlier, that we do have to be careful with when we're doing our education pieces and looking for feedback, the timing, and when those stakeholders are there. So I definitely agree with you. I think people show up when they're here versus giving feedback in other ways. But the question that I was going to have earlier was we're looking at defining more goals or additional goals for the committee. That's what it sounds like this conversation is about. One, what is the time frame that we're looking at? Are we just looking at now we want to set new goals for the next 6 months? And then the other piece is that as an advisory committee, we're here to help Vince. So I think it'd be great to hear what kind of goals we could set that would be helpful for you, or what pieces kind of make the most sense for if it's the next 6 months.
Vince, suggestions? Do you want to come back in 2 weeks?
How about, no, I like this. What I'd like to do is just email around to everyone first, collect suggestions for what, well, I'm going to put forward a few ideas first to see what people might be able to help with. I understand that at one point in, was it early January, there was a conversation about doing a summary of the various documents, kind of a Cliff Notes or abstract type book. I'm also kind of curious where that is. The original suggestion was that it might be of some use for consultants. I also think it could be of good usage for this committee and myself as kind of just a reference document for everything that we have, kind of capture everything that we currently have and see where the gaps are. Just kind of it could also serve as a kind of a gap analysis type study to see what information were we missing. We already know one or two of the things that we're missing, such as, say, other parts of the work that I'm involved in, say like a dredge plan or something like that. We know that needs to be developed. But what else do we need to develop that we don't know about yet? That the kind of great unknown.
And Vince, I had the same thought yesterday as I was preparing for the meeting, is that we did promise, several members of the committee promised to give you those abstracts, and to my knowledge, we haven't yet. So I take your point on that, and that was on my mind as well.
I think Pete had offered to make it into one document, hadn't you?
Yeah.
Are you still able to?
Yes. Nodded.
On that point, if we're developing goals like this and thinking about those reference documents, I know there's, at least one on my list to do, but there were no timeframes or end dates set when it was initially discussed. I wasn't here at the initial meeting, but that was the feedback that I got. So I think if we're going to do things like this, we all have other jobs and other things, so it just keeps falling off my list. I'm like, oh, no one's asked for it yet, so I'll just put that aside until next week. So I think if we're going to be effective at moving some of these things forward, it would make sense to have.
And it would, it would be a help to have a list of who has volunteered for what and what is available.
Yeah, Vince, if you want to send that out again.
Sure, I actually have that with me. I can absolutely send that. I could probably send it
no
next
need to
minutes.
shame us publicly.
It's okay. I know I'm at fault for some.
What was the thought? To the point of not providing these, we've been asked to review a lot of documents over the last 3 months, and so that's, I think, where our energy has gone. And I'm glad that we're bringing that back up again as a reminder that in our free time we have more work we can do. Yeah.
Free time.
Other ideas for goals, for timeframes, for any commitments that we want to make of ourselves.
I think
Mary, this is Gary.
Yeah.
We talked about this before, and I'm not sure how it gets done, but I think that to the extent we're able to put together some suggestions for people who are in the process of either renovating homes or building new homes, it would be great if we somehow could end up with some guidelines or some recommendations. For instance, I know that if you're building a home in the flood zone, as I recently did last year, it's pretty clear there can be no mechanicals underneath the house. The house has to be a certain height, and there can be no mechanicals underneath that. But my view is that with rising tides occurring over the next decade, it would be helpful if people who were in the process of renovating, even if they weren't in the flood zone, if there were at least these recommendations that, to the extent they can avoid doing it, with mechanical equipment not at ground level, but higher up in the house in the back or somewhere like that. So I hope we can figure out some way to come up with a series of those kinds of recommendations so that we don't have to wait for a year and a half before we can start helping members of the public who might benefit from those recommendations, at least get them some advice.
You're right, Gary, and it doesn't hurt to say it one more time. I think we agree that it's a pressing need, and that's what Sarah was talking about with the Education Committee's first goal. Isn't that?
Yeah, sorry, Gary, I don't know if you heard me before, but because I have a tiny mic, but I'm a very loud person usually. That's one of the goals of the Education Committee. We weren't going to go into extreme detail of build, the goal of the first document kind of brochure has some of those components. So moving a lot of things either up to the second floor or upstairs, some of those electrical things you're talking about. I don't have the example in front of me, so I can't remember all the pieces of it, but a lot of it was that kind of building material aspect. Obviously, that's more in a planning phase, whether you're going to do a renovation or you're building a house from the ground up. But the brochure would then also include things that people could just do more immediately, and that would include, renters too, valuables and things like that you'd want to put on your second floor. That was one of the examples that was from a brochure about keeping keeping things that are potential for flooding. Or how to protect your home, and so there's things that are in there that are building related, But it's meant to, the first document that we're putting together is meant to be, I say it's targeted towards homeowners, but it's meant to be kind of paint a broad brush for people who, who live on the island. I think that if we want some other specific educational materials to go out, I think that we can talk about that as a group too. But I think what I was going to kind of piggyback on after what Gary said was some of the goals for the larger group fall under education, but we can kind of diversify that more if we feel like we want to be doing more as a group. We started the subcommittee to kind of start like getting stuff done, but I think that as we come together with what the text is and have everybody review it and are happy with it, then that can be something that the full group kind of continues to do too. And also help, I think maybe we can put it on a future agenda, but we can share what we've identified as sort of our first couple of things that we'd like to put out, and the group, and I think this committee can kind of comment on, what the next items are, whether it's more handouts kind of thing or talks people want to give, or I think, to speak to Gary's point, we want to get a lot of that stuff done now so that during the season there's more opportunities for outreach and passing out materials, as well as like communicating the goals of the committee to the summer residents.
Just a thought. I know that the Builders Association meets regularly.
That's exactly what I was going to say, yeah.
And it might be, we might try to think about how we approach them, because they may have a lot of input. Not so much educating them. I mean, we need to educate them about what we're doing, but at the same time, try to see if they might have suggestions or thoughts about what could be done in terms of building with kind of the future in mind, without it actually being in building codes or anything else. They may have a lot of very simple ideas. So
A lot of that already is happening. A lot of that's already happening. My family did a building 25 years ago down on Steamboat Wharf. In that building, all the wires and things come from above. All the mechanicals are up above. It's concrete up to the window heights so that it can handle flooding. It's probably not high enough for what we're going to be dealing with, and we've sold it. But it has been happening for a while. I'm not sure it happens every time. I had a question, Gary, for you. What height were they talking when you did your building? What height were they? What was the recommended height to keep it?
It was about 8 feet. 8 feet. The FEMA recommendation, or the FEMA requirement is 8 feet. And so that's what we had to do. Our property was 2.5 feet above the ground normally, and so we had to add the skirt and lift it up to, as we were building, it's a brand new house, so it didn't matter. And so we had to go to 9 feet.
Gotcha. So you're at 9 and
8 feet.
8 feet. So,
No, I think we're at 8. I think we're at 8.
So under CONCOM regulations in flood zones, when, as Gary will, agree, that you have to have breakaway panels, you have to have the height,
Absolutely.
the necessary height, you have to have not only the mechanicals, but anything that is chemical and is stored up above the flood zone height of 8 feet. But I don't know to what extent insurance companies are driving the raising of existing buildings, but I would have thought it would be one idea we should think of is that, like having to bring your septic system up to code when you sell a property, that if you sell a property in the flood zone, that you have to raise it. So, and that the sooner that becomes a regulation, I would have thought the better.
That's interesting, Ian.
what we have to figure out is 8 feet the right number? Is 8 feet?
Well, it's the FEMA.
I understand, but that's sort of what we wanted to think about. Is 8 feet right, or should it be 9 or 10? And is there things sort of that should, you can raise it, but if you build it the same way you've always built, then you've still got all the wiring and everything else isn't encased, or it's not coming from above. It's still potentially rots and things. There's materials you can use, there's ways you can do it. So if it does get flooded in the winter, it's relatively, for a number of years, it'll be relatively easy it won't be ruined. It'll be relatively easy to use. A lot of those houses now, when they're flooded, they're a complete rebuild up to the water line.
Yeah.
So, so it's not just a matter of raising it, it's using the right materials so you don't have to rebuild the whole thing. You don't have to strip all the sheetrock out and start all over again.
Can I just address one small thing in that? And this came up in two different ways in the Coast Resilience Plan RFP. We've tried to build in two things: freeboard, which is FEMA plus an extra height. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet. I imagine that will eventually top out at a level that the HDC will say, all right, you just can't go any higher. So it'll have to be a two-prong approach, so that we'll have to find out, well, what will the HDC agree to and how high can we go, just to have redundancy. Second, we also built in to the RFP DFE, design flood elevation, which is a number that the consultants will recommend that we should all be building to. It'll most likely be substantially more than 8 feet, but we've approached it from two different ways. Now, I get the point that everyone's going to come back with, and I understand it. That's in the Coast Resilience Plan, which is year and a half, 2 years away. What can we do now? So that is something that I don't have an answer to, because I try to build as much into the Coast Resilience Plan RFP as I can.
One of the things that was in the hazard mitigation plan was repeat flood damage. I don't have the right terminology, but properties which had been identified as making more than one claim for flood damage by their insurance company. And there were some 60 of them on the island. It just struck me as interesting. I don't know what they have to go through when they've done that repeated claims. I don't know where the insurance company steps in and says, enough is enough, or you've got to do something about this.
Yeah. So there's a handful of different things in the HMP, and that is my next presentation.
Yeah.
So there's a lot in that this committee will be able to benefit from.
And a lot of what they've done, what the insurance company's done and the banks have done, is they've offloaded that expense onto the taxpayers. They've a high percentage of those properties are now Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae. They've moved them elsewhere so that they don't have to pay for it again. So they've put it on the backs of everybody else. So it's kind of, not all of them, but a good number of them have been moved. And so it's...
Okay. Anything further on goals for the committee? Because our next agenda item is the hazard mitigation plan, and we're just about ready to make that switch. Okay, Vince, you have something you want to tell us about to start, or did you just say you had a presentation to start with? Okay. There we go.
So this is just kind of something that kind of came up in the last meeting or two. So that how many people here have at least leafed through the hazard mitigation plan? It is a substantial report. It's 595 pages. It is a lot to take in, but basically all I'm going to look at today is the recommendations that came from it, a lot of which are currently being enacted. I must also apologise a little bit. This is text heavy and done in a bit of a hurry, seeing as we've only had a few work days to get this done. I spent half the day yesterday and this morning putting this together. It is a little rough and ready, and I apologise for that. So basically all we're doing is covering a quick overview that it was accepted in March 2019 by the town. I wasn't able to find out how long it took or how much it cost, which I can only apologise for. Hello.
That was good timing.
Hi. We might get to that question afterwards. Yeah, and it just looked at the potential natural hazards that the island faces and how we might need to respond to them. And the initial plan had 59 individual recommendations, and that got cut down a little over time, and others were added. But the initial, original plan had 59. Some were fairly close, so were put into the same recommendation in the end, while others were added later. So they use the Stepley scoring system. We've been over the Stepley at these committee meetings. The recommendations covered 8 different categories. One was just all hazards. It had 18 different recommendations. The numbers after show how many recommendations are in each of the 8 categories. Flooding, hurricane and tropical storms, sea level rise, 4. All 4 of those directly apply to something that the committee is doing. Summer storm, tornadoes, winter storms. Interesting, nothing in the last 4 summer storms, winter storms, wildfire and earthquakes. None of those have anything that would directly relate to any coast resilience type projects. So I'm only going to look at the 29 recommendations that directly apply to coast resilience. Arguably, all the recommendations could apply to coast resilience in some way, but I'm only going to look at the ones that directly apply.
I did the same tally. I came up with 42 that, in my view, were coastal resilience related. Yeah. But so I'm somewhere in the middle between your all and your 29. That makes perfect sense.
So I basically looked at ones that were very specific to flooding or mentioned sea level rise directly. Just that was kind of my criteria. Or ones that had erosion mentioned in them as well, I should also say. So basically, I'd like to advise everyone, please read the hazard mitigation plan. So knowing that these actions are in the hazard mitigation plan, we don't necessarily need to duplicate them in the coast resilience plan. These are pretty much already dealt with or even funded at this point because we're just about a year into this plan. Some items are very similar to items in the coast resilience plan, and they'll be approached differently. And it's important to say, to note, not nor, that the higher Stepley score items are already, I kind of got cut off here. I had a phone call. Apologies, I said it was a little rough and ready. I'm sorry. That the higher Stepley score items are already in effect. So just to kind of run through things in a fairly quick way, I don't want to end up reading huge, large blocks of text unless anyone would prefer that. I'm just going to cover what each action item is aimed at. Might mention the Stepley score and whether if it's in progress or what's happening with it. Some of them you'll actually recognize straight off the bat. Just also to mention, I can see Ian taking photographs. This will be available to everybody after this. I already sent it to Gary so that he could follow along on the phone. So the first one was in the all hazards category. It was mainly about reviewing bylaws and regulations and seeing where improvements could be made. Action item 7, A7 was about, A6 is already in progress. That's a nice one. And this is the kind of bylaw type stuff that we end up talking about here quite a lot. It's going to be a big one. A7, it looks at the location and cost and collaboration of the Steamship Authority for developing a new alternative shipping terminal. That has a relatively low, well, it's moderate to low Stepley score. That is not yet in progress, but it's good to know that that is one that is on the hazard mitigation plan's agenda.
I just make a comment. I don't know exactly where it originated from, nor am I suggesting it's a good idea necessarily, but there is a plan floating around that talked about locating the new terminal out on at the end of the West Jetty, and then bringing all the truck traffic in down the jetty and in through the beach. I saw a copy of it one time, but I don't know really how serious it was or where it came from.
I brought it. Yeah, it's at some point, we're going to have floodgates. I mean, rather than interrupting Vince, I was suggesting that it actually be costed out, because at some point you're going to need a seawall and floodgates, or the whole downtown is going to be underwater. So that's why I was suggesting it was better to cost these sort of things out now. But I wasn't advocating for a moment that we immediately shift everything over.
Thank you. A10 is mostly about historic structures. This is a plan that's in progress, and this is effectively the origin of the resilient. One of the origins of resilient Nantucket. There's 2 or 3 different parts in here I remember that relate to that project. A18, Develop Public Outreach Program. This is mainly aimed at schools. This is a low score. I don't think this one is in any way ready yet, but hopefully there's potential that the committee might be able to have some involvement in this. But as it's already part of the HMP, we might have to negotiate with Holly on that one, as she already has it as a strategy.
Is Holly going to be willing to share?
So as far as that particular, just to give everybody a process.
Yeah, closer to the mic, Holly. Sorry.
Once the HMP was adopted, I did reach out to department heads for those particular items that their departments are in charge of. Because at the end of the day, they're the people I need to work with. So they were emailed out after we received the formal approval and adoption. Of course, it's about time that I say, hey, just a friendly reminder, where do you stand on your status? Besides the people that are involved with our ongoing implementation meetings that we've been having for quite a while. But yes, my understanding from not talking directly to a staff person at the school, there is a person who handles the STEM program at the public schools. I can tell you personally from listening to my 4th grade daughter, they have been learning about weathering, and they were brought out to Sconset Bluff. So I do know that there's been part of that implemented into it. And then another thing, just to touch base on the beginning of Vince's presentation, and I apologize, as far as the funding source for this, we received a FEMA grant, which is administered through MEMA, the Massachusetts version of the Environmental Management Agency. That was roughly about a $36,000 grant. It was a reimbursable grant, which that means that the town was required to put in-kind services to a certain amount. So of course it didn't cost exactly that. It was a little bit more than that. But we did receive, I'm happy to say, after all the applicable documentation that is required to get our money back, we got it all back. So that was about a 1.5 years, almost 2-year process, I'd say. I was not involved with the beginning process to receive the funding. That was something that Mr. Fonzuto did prior to my receiving. Pretty much when he retired, he already secured the funds from the state, and he just said, here you go. So that's kind of to give you a little heads up on that. But yes, if there's action items in the HMP that you feel that there's something like the public outreach that you would want to let me know, I think that would be good. But for the most part, all of these I've identified. They're either newly identified, if you're not familiar with the HMP as far as when it was originally created, the whole process was created out of the 2000 Disaster Act. Town of Nantucket received their first HMP in 2007. We had a plethora of action items to be achieved. And when we had our initial kickoff meeting with the consultant to do the update, it was to go through, okay, what has been achieved, what hasn't. And there've been quite a few that weren't, that we put back in. But then FEMA changed their regulations, and they said, we don't want you to just put this whole big plethora of actions in here. We want you to narrow it down to items that you can achieve within 5 years. So that's the time frame that's very important to understand and consider. Because of course with funding sources, if we as a town are not going to put it within the capital improvement plan, which I will tell you there have been quite a few that were this past budget cycle, of course we want to achieve or to apply for any of those grants. Vince had mentioned the Resilient Nantucket. We just started our kickoff this past week. Item A10, and there's another one, it might be A8. I don't remember at the top of my head, but there's 2 strategies in the HMP and one strategy within the MVP that allowed us to acquire that MVP grant for Resilient Nantucket. So as you can see, you know, the funding source can cross over between federal and state. As I've always said, as a planner, if you have a plan that has an action item in there, we're more eligible, if you will, to receive funding for that. So I'll sit back down now.
Thanks, Holly. And I was Holly Backus, and you're now the Historic Preservation Planner. Is that the right title for you?
Yes, as of November, my title is Preservation Planner, and I'm also the Local Hazard Mitigation Plan Coordinator for the town.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. So F2, which now has elements of F4 in it, is all about the drainage study for the downtown area. This one's in progress, as is the CCTV study for the stormwater system. That's underway, and as I understand it, pretty close to being concluded. F5 is the Consu Springs drainage and outfall discharge area. That's in progress as well. I'm not really sure when that one's due to be complete. All I know is that it's being worked on. The stormwater
On those, like on F6, what are they basing the use on, or the need? Is it just current need, or are they projecting out X amount of more?
So for the most part, the Stepley score tries to take into account a large number of things. So that's how they ended up with the scoring system.
No, I'm not worried about Stepley. I'm saying, okay, we're in progress doing a study of the downtown. How are they studying the status quo? Are they studying 30 years out, 50 years out? What's the?
Oh, I just don't know that.
Yeah. Okay. I think those are the kind of. I think where we can possibly do the most is be asking those questions, you know, and asking for clarification. Because when we go and do these, if we're just doing it based on, well, this is what happens at Brant Point now, then we may be missing the opportunity to say, hey, it's not going to be that much water. It's going to be twice as much water, or 3 times. I don't know what the numbers are, but
yeah.
Anyway, just a
No,
comment.
it's a really good point. In other words, who is handling the master drainage study, and can they come and talk to us, you know, so that we really get a handle on what's happening in other parts of this issue?
Well, it's a DPW project, and I guess we could, but effectively seeing, I'll have a look into it.
Great, thank you.
I think that's good. I mean, and I'm not saying that they don't do a good job or anything. They do, and I'm not saying we should tell them what to do. But we should, I mean, my comment is to make sure that we're, you know, when we do these projects, we're thinking ahead. We don't have another, you know, they just did the down on the wall, $1 million, $2 million building for the harbor master. And then they didn't even do it at the right height because, we'd have to have a lot of ramps. You know, so that's my point is, well, we should be, if we're thinking about this and spending those kinds of numbers, I think we want to make sure that we're, you know, being as smart as we can about it. That's all.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I think it's important to understand that I'm just trying to give an overview of the HMP, and that we're not necessarily a review committee for the HMP. I appreciate what you're saying, though.
Then some of that is semantics. It's you know, if there's somehow we have to get this into the culture of the town. If we get pushback, and I'm not saying that you're pushing back, but I sense sometimes that this pushback of don't tell us what to do. We've got a plan, and these guys did the plan, and it's the plan. But what if the plan is wrong? What if the plan didn't take into consideration some of the things that we're now talking about? Then that's not a very smart plan. That's not a very good use of town money. So, you know, if we're not going to talk about that because we don't want someone mad at us, then what are we doing? You know, I have better uses of my time, but I mean, I'm not saying that we go and we micromanage every single thing, but I think we shouldn't be, my point is not to be worried about upsetting people a little bit and not to be worried about speaking out a little bit. That's all.
And I just want to piggyback on what Matt was saying. I think that I would be really interested to hear about this in progress, and not to micromanage and nitpick and say people are doing things wrong. But because of this committee, I mean, we've talked about the importance of drainage, and we reviewed the videos that were from previous or other committees where they talked about the storm drains and drainage. So hearing where this is at would be really interesting and I think beneficial. But then also to ask some of those questions. And so I'm not looking at it like you're presenting this so that we can review it. I'm looking at more like we've always talked about having speakers. And so I think this is a speaker that I think would be, I would personally really like to hear from.
So we did have Rob McNeil introduce us to the topic of the stormwater and some of the challenges that the town faces. And that's when we found out that he was working on a plan, but we don't really know the status and how that's progressing. One of the things I like about the plans is that now they're coming with 5-year time horizons. So the plan needs to be updated and reviewed every 5 years. And that does give the opportunity to say, well, it was a good plan when it was just looking at the current scenario, but now we need to introduce additional information to guide us.
But some of the key is up front. If you're going to put a pipe in and you get the pipe the right size, then you're not digging up the road and doing all this stuff later. You know, I just want to make sure we're taking a long enough view. You know, and maybe the first 5 years doesn't matter, but it might matter a lot. It depends how, you know, what we're actually doing. So.
I heard Rob give a presentation, and I don't remember whether it was to the planning board or who it was addressing, but I know he was talking about the drainage system, and I know to some extent he was indicating the need to increase the size of all the piping. I don't know to what degree and how far out he was thinking, but clearly he wasn't just thinking about replacement. He's quite aware that the size of the piping needs to be increased quite a bit.
In the presentation he did to our committee, that was one of the questions that he brought up. And he didn't answer it by saying he's chosen X or Y. He said the town has to make a choice which way they want to go. I think his point was it's not really up to him as the engineering person to set the policy, but there's a policy question, to Matt's point, that should come first before you do the engineering.
And, you know, that is ultimately, I understand, part of this subcommittee is to recommend policy decisions to the select board. So I think at some point it would be, you know, we're all on the same page of wanting to hear more.
What happens sometimes with stuff like this is the policy is kind of set by, well, that's more money and this is all we have. And I think sometimes that's, you know, we should be, sometimes that's, you know, what is it, penny wise, pound foolish. You spend less money now because, well, that's all we have because we have to do other stuff. And then, you know, 5-10 years later, you're doing it again. The perfect example, and I've been on this for, you know, 25 years now, 20 years, is sewers. You know, 20 years ago, I was asking, is that big enough? How are we doing it? Yep, that's big. The engineer says it's okay, et cetera, et cetera. We finally got to the point where we're actually, it took 20 or 25 years to do you know, now they're doing a study of what size sewer pipes they actually need to capture these areas. And whenever they come to the select board, and I know they're trying to do the right thing, I'm not being critical, but I'm just saying, you know, whenever they come, I keep asking, you know, are we checking what the engineers are giving you? The private engineers are giving something for a single development or a single house, and they're not capturing potentially all of the area. So, you know, and so I keep going back, and I think finally we're spending a lot of money, but they're actually looking at the total system and what it will actually take. And instead of, you know, 8-inch pipes, 10-inch pipes, they're putting 12s and 16s in. And I think so I'm just taking sort of my experience over 20, 25 years just on sewers alone as we've come up to speed as a town, saying, can we come up to speed quicker on stormwater? That's all.
Okay, Vince, back to you.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
So I think we've quite convincingly covered the stormwater management plan, and I will see about getting Rob to come and speak on that a little more again. F8 is about design guidelines to encourage floodproofing evaluation of structures while maintaining their historic character. That also feeds into the project we launched last Friday, the Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaptation project. I also think that the Children's Beach Stormworks project, F9, is something that we could talk about ad infinitum as well. The important thing to note here is that there's only a temporary solution in place at the moment, and there is currently a long-term solution in review. In fact, I was down there over the weekend. There's pink flagging in the area, and I'm curious if they're going to start sometime soon. So F11 about educate residents, developers, and regulatory tool zoning regulations. This is something that we have been talking about here for the last few weeks, and hopefully at the next meeting I will be able to bring back something else on that. But that is more directly related to coast resilience, not to the hazard mitigation plan. F12, height exemptions for buildings elevating to the first floor. This is something that Gary was getting to a while ago. And then the F13, adapt local freeboard standards to include AE zones. So that's fine, but we just have to have a little look first what AE zones are. So I just included a quick map. Basically everything below the dark green and purple in elevation. The coastal resilience plan, by contrast, will take in everything up to the purple, as high as has been forecast, and probably a little higher depending on what the consultants recommend.
So what height? Can you go back to that map?
Sure.
Thank you. So what height is the rest of the map that isn't dark green and purple?
So dark green and purple are the two highest elevations. In terms of physical height, the dark green,
below the dark green and purple.
Oh, below the dark green and purple is below 10 feet, roughly speaking.
Really?
Not as... do you see the kind of dark yellow color that goes to the back of the, what would you call that? The area around Brant Point. That line that runs down from Cliffside to Brant Point, that's pretty much dead on 10 feet.
Can I ask a question? What is AE? I don't know and what is freeboard? I don't know what any of those words are. In the previous slide when you were saying.
So these are the FEMA flood zone elevations, and freeboard is an elevation that you choose beyond these elevations. So for the most part, as Gary said earlier, 8 feet is what the town requires, 8 feet above sea level, so to speak, above mean low water, I think it is. Then the freeboard would say, right, okay, so FEMA recommends 8 feet. Freeboard is anything over 8 feet. So that it gives you kind of redundancy. It's a simple way of thinking of it.
Surely it's above mean high tide, not low tide.
Open to correction on that. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah.
So these ones here, these all kind of group together. Effectively, these are the points on roads, from Nantucket Road, Pulpus Road, in two different spots in Wauwinet that all flood. They all have the same recommendation. The only thing different between them is the names. So these are places that we already know that have problems. First and Second Bridge, Fulling Mill Road on Palpus, Sackaja Pond is the kind of an interesting one here because there's already a temporary solution in place there, and we're in the review process for a permanent solution, only because that road washed out, about a year and a half ago. So all of those kind of group together, we know the problems, and they all have about the same Stepley score. They're moderately high, so they will get funded relatively soon. And as Holly said, within the 5-year cycle.
To follow up on Matt's point, when these get funded, do we know at this point what their design is going to address? Is it going to address current conditions or future conditions? Or
so it says final elevation to be examined and analysed considering sea level rise. So that's just the recommendation. I don't know how far that carries.
Vince. So F16 is actually a gift to the town from a property owner within that area. So they are funding the engineering for that. As far as I know, it's ongoing. I have not seen a progress in a while, but that is something that's been a joint communication between DPW, the consultant, and Natural Resources. But where that stands, I can't speak. And then F-17 is a prime example of something that was in the original HMP and that I remember as a kid it being an issue. And then with that last storm that we had in 2018, which really became the catalyst for making sure that we could do something about it. And that was one I believe that we received a CZM grant for working on the inside of Sacajapond. So those two are ongoing right now. Just to give you a little.
So, Holly, I think, so I'd like to know whether or not it would be worthwhile examining putting in an elevated roadway there to allow flood water to go underneath and to have that sort of discussion where if they're putting money into it, that the road be raised 5 or 6 feet. Ugly as it might look in some ways, that's going to be another issue, but at least it allows for stormwater to go through to the wetland beyond rather than acting as a sort of hard barrier.
At Folgers Creek, I think that is, yes. I mean, I know that was a topic of conversation that we've actually had with some college students out there at UMass Field Station. But again, I'm not too sure on what that engineer has come up with. Again, it's not just because it's this section, this issue is just for the engineering component. Does that mean that the town is going to say, oh, okay, we agree with you? We don't know. It could be just a gift where we review it, we say, we appreciate it, but we're going to move forward in doing something else. I really can't speak to that, but yes, those items were discussed. Do we want to elevate? How does that handle with the road? What do we do with the bike path? There's all these things that need to come up with. So, at the end of the day, if you remember that the HMP is required for us to make sure we receive FEMA funding in case of a natural disaster. It also gets us thinking and planning in the appropriate direction. Does that mean that these items that are in there that they're by God and we have to do them? Not necessarily, because when we do the update, as part of my job, I have to make sure that we're letting FEMA and MEMA know where we stand with each individual priority, why we haven't done what we've done, and what we've done, but maybe not necessarily achieved it, or ones that we've fully completed. I will say on that, when we received the adoption in last spring, at the time that Select Board gave us their blessing, we had 11% of these actions already done or in the process. So that's pretty good. I actually got a props from MEMA directly when we told them that before we received that approval. So that's good. We're also not putting this plan, it's a living, breathing document. It's not just sitting on a shelf. We're ongoing talking about different things. I mean, the fact of the matter that you all are created, I really think the update to the HMP, the process that we had with the MVP program, really was the start of thinking about coastal resiliency and creating you all. So they all work together.
Question? Holly, to what, I know the town likes to rely on funding from someplace else other than having the taxpayers pay for it, but to what extent are we limited in terms of what we might want to do by the agency or entity that's providing the money? In other words, are they dictating how it'll be built, how high it'll be built, so that by relying on outside money, we're in fact limited by what we might be able or want to do?
So I can speak in part to the Pulpus Road and Sacajapond. The CZM grant that we received was just on the design, and I know Vince can speak more on exactly what that is. But as far as that goes, that was just the engineering component. A lot of these projects, people think that it's just that, and it's just one face value. There's multiple stages to achieve that. So of course there's going to be the engineering planning of it. There's also going to be the implementation of it. So the town, we've looked at diligently these items and what does it take for us to achieve? Say this one was twofold. We got a grant for the engineering component of it, but We're going to need to have funding from somewhere. So I know that was included with our batch, if you will, to FinCom for funding sources. We're very diligent on making sure that these particular items that we know we're not necessarily going to receive a grant for, or we don't want to necessarily assume we're going to get a grant for. So we are trying to plan appropriately, but also I think conservatively too. We're trying to find that medium ground, because if there is funding source for it, we don't want to discard it. We want to apply for it, and we have tried to do that in some location, in some instances. We haven't been 100% successful, but with the ones that we have been, we're really happy for. I mean, the fact of the matter that we were able to utilize the state's MVP program to achieve 3 different priorities within 2 different plans is pretty good. So yes, we are trying to make sure we're not limited to that, but that action up there is not just one action. It's got multiple layers to it.
It just interesting, because what Ian was talking about, if you engineer something and you're engineering it, you say we want to engineer it to protect the road, they may or may, if you don't say to protect the road and to have water flowing into the wetlands, you'll get a different response. So you say, I want to protect the road, and they'll give you something to protect the road. If you say, I want to protect the road, but have, water flowing freely into the wetland, because that's conservation land and we'll be able to expand the wetland, they'll give you something different. And so that's why, how you ask the question. And I was fortunate, and if I've told you a story, tell me to stop. But before Walter Barnacky died, he told me the story about how he built the docks where they did. And he had the best, he went to the best engineers for, dock building in the country and said, I want to build docks on Nantucket. And they, he spent a lot of money, and they said, oh, yep, you go down here and you fill in the wetlands. So he said, oh, I don't want to fill in the wetlands. I'll go back and I'll ask the second best people. And he said, okay, how do I do it? And they said, yep, you go right down here and you fill those wetlands in down by the creeks. So then he went back to the third engineer after spending a ton of money and saying, what am I doing? And he said, I want to build the docks next to the town. And I don't want to build them in the wetlands. And they came back with what we have now. So that's why, the question you ask sometimes gives you back the answer. And I think that, so that's sort of why we're talking like this. I think, and Ian's is a perfect example. I wouldn't have thought of those wetlands. It makes complete sense. But in my head, I'm thinking, oh, protect that road. But protecting that road might mean protecting those wetlands, But it wouldn't have been my first thought. And if that came to me in front of the select board, I probably wouldn't have flagged that. I probably would have voted for that. Whereas now, if it comes in front of us, I might question it a little more. Only because of her, unless I forget by then, which I could. But if I don't, or if Ian isn't sitting there at the meeting, I could forget it again. So anyway.
Well, and to that point, one of the reasons we have a problem there is because the culvert that was put in was undersized to begin with, probably because it was sized by the road engineer and not by the Conservation Foundation.
I mean, I will say in one respect we're lucky, because most of these places that we're looking at these issues, the abutting property owners really are conservation groups. And I can say that, particularly with, and it's not fully Millbrook, it's Folgers Marsh, but with the Folgers Marsh property, the Conservation Foundation is very actively involved in what's going into that engineering plan, which has had no movement in years. And I just want to do a side plug that culverts are no longer the accepted method for controlling sea level rise. Waters under roads, it's elevating roads and doing bridges is really what's being recommended around the country. That you can't design your culverts for the appropriate size and the maintenance of the salt marshes on either side. So we do have voices that are paying attention, but I think that we need to raise that attention everywhere, and hopefully that's what we're doing here.
Great, thank you, Jen.
Yep.
Vince, back to you, I guess.
Thank you. And just to back up Jen's point just a tiny bit more before I go on, a bridge in that area would restore the wetland behind the current culvert as well, and that would also be a type of green infrastructure that we could benefit from.
We're trying.
But that's really, I'm saying that's really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then so say we get something that says, we got a hard armor or whatever, we could come back and, if someone's going to donate $500,000 or whatever, if someone's going to donate a ton of money, but it's gonna cost us 3 tons. Well, why don't we take the ton and we add the other 2? And, you know, and do it better at the beginning, is sort of how I look at it. So.
Well, and I do think these kinds of projects, these things that are happening, and we've kind of been asking for this a little bit over time, or what are the projects that are going on around the island that we should sit down and take a look at. So even just going through this and seeing what's coming out of the hazard mitigation plan is bringing all these things up, but knowing that, you know, if we had a project like what's at Pulpus and said, oh, someone's looking at doing a road there and there wasn't conservation land on either side, then we'd say perhaps those are people we need to target and at least raise their awareness of the issues. I think that that's probably a good function of this committee. So this is helping with that.
Thank you. So in this slide, F20, 21 and F22 are all somewhat potentially linked at any rate. They're all in the same area. They're for increased resilience, so to speak, of the finance department building, the harbour master's facility at the town pier, and also looking further down the road for long-term harbour master facility planning. F23 is mainly about maintenance program for the drainage system. We've already covered that in detail. And F24 is mainly about low-lying areas, installing watertight sewer manholes in those areas. F25 is mainly about the correct protocol for how and when to close the boat ramp at Children's Beach for the to make it into a floodwater barrier. And then for F26 is about contacting repetitive loss homeowners, which Mary was talking about earlier. Do you want to mention anything on that? You already covered it. Yeah. Okay. So that covers all of the parts in flooding that were somewhat relevant to the work of this committee. Hurricane and tropical storms didn't have anything that really directly related to coastal resilience. So obviously you didn't include anything there, and move straight on to the next one that was sea level rise, shoreline change and erosion. Top one there is basically directly related and is one of the founding reasons why we're here. It's one of the few I'll read in its entirety. It's complete the community coastal resilience plan and become an MVP community. That has the highest Stepley score in this whole report. It's 9. There's a few 8s and a lot of 7s, but this is the only 9. This is the highest scoring priority from this plan. It's also very valuable to be able to say that the MVP community status has been achieved, and the action is considered complete because the Coastal Resilience Plan process has started. We're funded for that. This committee is in place, another action, all in that. We don't have a Coastal Resilience Plan yet, but because we're on our way to doing that, this action is well underway at any rate. We also know, and I have mentioned at meetings here in the past, that this year, 2020, we're hoping to update the Nantucket and Nantucket Harbours action plans. That's come up here before. SC3 and SC4 are effectively linked. Hopefully these will take place as hopefully one large action in 2021 to do a sediment transport study for the whole island, including harbours.
Is there any idea of the cost?
I don't have a number for that. I know Jeff has been working on that. So Jeff Carlson, Director of Natural Resources. Can I come back to you with that?
I can ask him. Yeah.
Okay, but I'm sure the committee would be interested too.
Excuse me.
This is a new plan. It's kind of an updated version of one of the already existing plans, F19. The wording of it changed quite substantially, but it's basically to relocate hard copies of town records. This is something that directly affects my department, so I can just talk about that. We're obviously in a flood zone. We have many filing cabinets with original copies, as we always take PDFs as well, but original copies have to be there for the public to come and review at any time. And they are in a flood zone. So these are going to be moved and also more correctly stored over time.
We've got also down in the assessors and
Yep.
Catherine Stover Town Clerk's office, we have 300-year-old documents all down there. It's, and so far so good, but eventually it won't be.
Yeah.
Yep.
One of my hopes is when we do it, was talking about a facilities master plan, I think maybe this week or next week, and sort of, it's been pushed off for a zillion years. I think at some point there's gonna end up being a building on the corner of Old South and Fairgrounds. Even though we're talking about it, I think that's probably what will happen, and I hope that we go down 2 or 3 floors, even if we aren't using them, a couple floors, because you're always gonna need, this is sort of high ground, and you're gonna need a place to store things.
I was just going to ask, what's the elevation here, out of curiosity?
Well, I'm not sure, but it's pretty dry. I don't know technically, I've dug holes down here, and it's
There's not a
bone
lot
dry.
of wetlands in this area.
It's
There is a
bone dry.
groundwater recharge district, so
Yeah.
that could be.
It's sort of this way, you've got some of that, but, so anyway.
Thanks. Effectively, that's it. The other final 4 categories, they only had 2 items in them each, but none of them were what I might call or consider directly related to coastal resilience. That's basically all I had for this. Thank you very much.
And my only other comment, just, it's sort of design it right for 30 or 50 years, but the other thing is design it so that it can be raised. So when if we're having someone engineer something, you're engineering it to solve the issue now, but also be flexible enough to be raised. So if you're raising the roads, okay, the roads have to get raised 6 feet now, but make sure that they can lift them up and put another cone or something under them and make them 10 feet. I mean, there's things like that we should be putting into our thought process and into the sort of RFPs and stuff now, and it would save us a lot of money later.
Right, if you had to move the road in order to achieve 10 feet, well, why not just move the road in the first place so that when you need 10 feet, you can get it? And do it once instead of twice.
Or if you're building a bridge, if you're building a raised road, build it so that the bridge can be lifted, bridge sections can be lifted up and more height can be put underneath when the time comes. Then you're just fixing the 2 ends of the road instead of tearing the whole thing out and starting again. So, I mean, and they do that. If you drive down to the Keys and you see some of those new bridges, they're sort of modular. They put them together and drop them in place. It's not that simple, but it's a lot easier than rebuilding.
So Vince, I reviewed the strategies from the hazard mitigation plan and went through the plan again, and something just screamed out at me, and I'm not sure if it's a feature or a flaw. So on 6.4 in the plan, it says erosion is necessary and natural, and goes on to say the challenge is to site coastal development in a manner that allows the natural physical coastal processes such as erosion to continue. And there are no recommendations for strategies to deal with erosion in this document. And yet erosion was identified by the people who were participating in this as their top concern, as the number one thing that needs to be addressed. And erosion is the problem that is happening every day, all the time on Nantucket, where flooding is intermittent. And so I didn't know why erosion was not to be mentioned in this. And I don't have an answer. I don't know if anybody else does.
I don't.
I kind of do.
Yeah.
So, it's not eroding and then going away forever. It's eroding one place and being deposited in another place. It's a constant process. It's a constant moving of sand all the time, all around the island by littoral drift, longshore current. So the South Shore, for instance, starting somewhere around Tom Nevers, sand is being moved all the way down, all the way to the tip of Smith's Point, and it's constantly being moved from down there, and it's constantly being put down there at Tom Nevers by the coastal, geological processes. So it's not like an excavator is sitting in one place and digging sand away and taking it away and we never get it back. So it may not be as big of an issue. I mean, I'm sure it is for people, SPPF and all, but it's the movement of sand. And if you get in the way of that, if you deprive the ocean from taking the sand from where the sediment source is, then that becomes a problem. That accelerates the erosion on either end of the structure. So,
and I think the discussion of water and flooding and increased storms accelerates a lot of the erosion. So I think some of the discussions of the water and whether it's storm surge or flooding or all those things are actually relating to dealing with the water actually helps affect some buffering against erosion.
So my real question is, does the town have a policy that erosion should not be interrupted? I mean, I think that if we do have that policy, that has to inform a lot of what we decide we want to do. But if we don't have that policy, then we need to listen to the people who are saying, please do something about this, and we need to guide them on what is possible to do. So I'm just sort of torn between, I understand the natural processes and that sometimes meddling with nature is worse than leaving it alone. But what is our policy statement regarding this?
We don't have one.
There isn't one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we have one?
I'd like to hear Holly before I.
Yeah, Holly.
I just wanted to add about the whole erosion issues and whether or not one believes one form of fixing it fixes the other. I'm trying to touch on that lightly. It's political. And I can tell you our consultants did feel that. Staff felt that to a point where, that did uphold a little bit of us trying to get the approval blessed for the adoption because of the political nature of what erosion and what's been going on the island. But I think I think Sarah hit the nail on the head there. It all plays together. So if you create policies on one aspect, that's going to help with the erosion as far as how we're going to handle it. Now, there's a lot of up to debate. Does the town want to get involved with telling people that you can't utilize property that's having erosion issues? Again, it falls back on being a political in nature. So whereas the HMP is really more of here's the facts, these are things that you can do. And again, it also boils down to with what our discussion is going to be with Resilient Nantucket. These are the things you can do. This is what both FEMA and National Park Service recommend you can do under the Secretary of Interior standards, for a historic structure or infill in a National Historic Landmark. These are items that we can do. It's going to be up to us to figure out what we want to see as an island, as a community, moving forward. But the erosion was a topic of concern for the approval.
Yeah, I wasn't a part of the hazard mitigation plan process, so I don't know how that was handled in that process. Thank you, Holly.
Yeah, I would say I don't think it's a policy per se, but I agree with Holly that it has been very politicized. And I think that I think our job as a group is to try to unpoliticize some of it. I think that there are places that we're going to have to hard armor in some type. It might be a green solution hard armor or something else, the harbor or downtown. I think there's places that we all agree, it's appropriate. It's already there. We may have to. There's going to be other places that we're going to say we're going to retreat or we're going to do this and retreat in a certain amount of time. I think that's, I think that we have to sort of get through that and not be bullied by one side or the other of sort of the debate. I think we should be saying, here's the best thing to do. Like Ian was saying about, raise this road. Don't just harbor on it to worry about the road, worry about both things. We should be saying the same thing about erosion. And I agree with what Peter's saying about it goes from one side to the other. But I'm not sure that we get it all back anymore. I think it's sum total. When you look at how much sand has come off the, over 100 years, 100 something years from the South Shore, I don't think that amount of acreage is found itself to Nantucket or to the North Shore. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd love to be corrected. And I think as sea level rise goes up, we're going to find that we're shrinking. It isn't just a matter of taking it from one side, going to the other, and we'll just move everyone across the island as it grows. I think we're going to find the island shrinking. And so then there is a question of what places do you accept something that maybe we don't accept right now.
And my thought is, do we have to answer that before we can really move forward with other things? are we just kicking that can down the road until it's too late?
I would say
yeah?
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, and I look at it, maybe I'm being simplistic, but I politically, I think people would all say downtown, you do whatever you have to do downtown. And I think they'd say some of these other places are just retreat, Nantucket or, a single home on Sheep's Pond or something, that's just retreat. And then the tough ones are things like Baxter Road or, sort of places that are just out that have a good number of people and a good amount of value that it's difficult, that people feel very strongly about. Those are the ones that, we really need to almost spend more time on. How do you do it for how long? What is appropriate or not there? Those are I think those are hard discussions, but I think those are what I hope we eventually get to.
And Vince, do you expect that the consultants doing the coastal resilience plan will come back with specific recommendations to like this property doesn't warrant the investment that it would take to save it, but that property does? Or do you have an idea yet what we'll get out of that plan?
That's down to the risk assessment. So we'll have to just see what that comes back with. I don't mean to be putting off your question, but we just need to see what that reports with. I'm sorry that I can't be.
No, I'm trying to feel my way through this. So
Well, but I think this is where it sort of combines with Matt's previous point about how you ask the question sort of frames the answer. And I think it's important to know how much sand and how much it would cost going forward to protect the head of the harbor with sea level rise, and you're trying to protect the town as well. And these are sort of questions I'd like the consultants to actually deal with and give the town hard figures. We understand their total estimates, but I want that sort of, I think that's what would be most useful to the select board going forward, is have some of those issues addressed in their report, and it's sort of disconcerting to hear you say that, Holly, about how the politics of the erosion enters into the equation, but of course it does, I mean.
Ian, it's a good thing that the Conservation Commission's appeal of DEP's superseding order of conditions has distance between what Matt's talking about, doing hard armoring where we need to do it, because if we say, if the town says, well, we need to do it here, but you people over here, we don't want you doing it, it makes it, that'll be a fight.
Oh,
for sure. And it'll be a fight around the island where neighborhoods will say, well, we need to do what you guys did in town. And the town says, no, we don't want you doing it there. It brings up the question of hard armoring the entire island because, oh no, here comes the water. So.
right. But again, that precipitates us sort of figuring out what's acceptable, what's the right way to do it. In places like in the Netherlands, they'll extend a little bit and they'll make public, they'll put marshes in a public pathway so that their barricade or their blockage is something that everyone likes and buys into. So the town, it may be something like that where we get more walking and more public Chapter 91 public space and and lots of shellfish and things, and that might be acceptable. Whereas you wouldn't be doing that. I kind of think you talked about value. I think Mary did. I think for me, I think a lot of it comes down to value. If you're saying the people in the area are going to have to fund it, and they're going to have to do it in the least intrusive, most environmentally friendly way, and they got to pay for it, I think that takes care of a lot of the issues because, there's a lot of people downtown, so you're sharing it among a lot of people. It'll still cost a ton, but it could go on the tax base and be paid for. You're sharing it among 4 people in Sheep Pond, it probably won't happen. Or if it does, it'll happen for a few years and then be done. So I just think I kind of think that how it's paid for, if we just say, well, the government will pay for it, it'll just go on the tax base and everyone gets whatever they want, we're all broke, and we won't make good decisions because we won't be considering what the costs are. But if we actually add the costs in like we're trying to do, what I worry about in this conversation is if we're following the hazard mitigation plan, which is kind of saying on purpose or not on purpose, just said erosion will happen and we're going to let it happen, is that going to lead to what the result we're going to get? Or should we, is that going to lead to whatever the answer from these consultants is going to be? If that's baked in, if they read these documents and they, sort of infer the same thing you just inferred, then are we gonna get back something that's biased that way?
Well, and it brings up the other issue about, do you ask the consultants to actually say where it'd be cheaper for the town to have a compulsory purchase or a program that helps houses that, are post-78 and are entitled to protection even under our local bylaws, to help them move it or to buy it out so that you can guarantee future access to the beach for the public rather than having the peninsular effect all around the island. So,
I mean, I'm hoping one of the benefits of at least what we've asked for in the RFP for the Coastal Resiliency Plan, and hopefully what we get back, is that we have really asked for this island-wide picture, and we've specifically laid out the idea of flooding, sea level rise, and erosion, and asked them to then kind of break down after that risk assessment, what do we value on the island? What is at risk to each of those hazards or combinations of those hazards? And then when we see it laid out, that's partly when that values piece is going to come into play, with looking at what those, what are the risks and then what are the potential solutions. And, I think a lot of maybe why erosion, partly politically, but partly why it's missing in a lot of this, is most of our major erosion issues on island end up being private property. And so I think that hasn't necessarily been addressed in a lot of this, is focusing on the actions that the town can take on infrastructure, town-owned properties, those kinds of things. Whereas when we're moving into the Coastal Resiliency Plan, we're looking island-wide and have said that we're basically going to look at policy implementations when it comes to private property, or look at what are the solutions for larger scale areas. So I think that we're going to hit at that. I just think that the other plans haven't been able to hit at it before.
You got it. Right on top. The HMP is prescriptive. We have guidelines we have to follow for federal law. The Coastal Resiliency Plan, there isn't. It's up to you all and how that RFP is laid out. And I know with your time and effort, Vince's time and effort, rest of staff time and effort into that RFP is going to provide a document from that consultant, whoever that is, to do what you all want to do, what we all foresee for the island. Whereas the HMP, it is literally what FEMA tells us we need to do. Yeah. But it's a good source of creating those priorities that eventually will just get that planning mindset of how that document brings you to other documents and even funding sources. So.
Is it fair to say that FEMA is not significantly concerned with erosion as emergency management because it is an ongoing process, as opposed to a flood or a storm, which is a emergency sort of process?
I don't really want to speak for FEMA.
Well, I mean, contextually, I mean, is that possibly?
I think.
Yeah.
I think even from a planning perspective, I just received an email right now from the American Planning Association that's talking about hazard mitigation plans and looking for planners' input on their policies that they see those documents flourishing. So resiliency is a new topic in everything planning and everything even preservation wise. So it's a new and ongoing thing. I think there are ways for the whole topic to evolve. I think when you just look at the HMP and realize that the consultant was required to indicate to the state, MEMA and FEMA, state and federal government, of what has been happening on Nantucket, not necessarily what the town may or may not want. So that is very important. So that's why that kind of rule reared its ugly head, if you will, because not everybody was satisfied with what's been happening on the eastern side of the island, excuse me. So that, it was just more a matter of statement. Erosion has been happening. This is what some people have been doing, and even some of the wording had to be changed so that way everybody was happy. Maybe this is not much of a topic of conversation with other locations, but then again, not everywhere is an island. Mm-hmm. We're unique in so many ways, and I think I keep on saying this to a lot of different places, on so many different levels. So we are not looking at the silo. This is our community. We're required to have it for, say, tornadoes. no. We are required to have it for all these natural hazards. If you put that in perspective, that makes it, I guess, understand a little bit better. It's going to be up to the CRP to get down in the nitty gritty and help guide the island to plan appropriately.
Okay, so I think the important thing is that it's not a policy statement in the hazard mitigation plan, even though the plan was accepted by the select board. It's simply part of that constrained process for the FEMA requirement. Got it. Thank you.
Mary,
Yes, Gary.
are you referring to the paragraph? There's a very interesting paragraph on page 6-4
Yes.
at the bottom,
Yep.
which is talking about, but the end of that paragraph says, the challenge is to site coastal development in a manner that allows natural physical coastal processes such as erosion to continue.
Correct. That was one of the ones I read out.
That they expect that the natural physical processes will continue, and we're talking about maybe we have to make decisions where we're going to not allow that to continue.
Well, I
Be the right decision.
I think Peter's point was
What the study says.
Peter's point was that erosion is going to continue. It's just a question of where. So there is no stopping it. It's just that you can shift it from one point to another, and that brings its own considerations.
But when we're talking about protecting the town, we're actually talking more about protecting it from flooding than erosion. So it is in some ways a subset of the overall problem that we're facing.
But erosion is going to bring in flooding as the water comes up, and then erosion affects certain areas where the resiliency plan will have hopefully things in place that will deal with that when that happens in that area. So Smith's point.
I mean, these are all things we're going to have to make informed decisions on, but hopefully that's the point of having the plan together that does that risk analysis island-wide, and then see if there are particular areas that are eroding that we will have to think about what that means for the rest of the island.
All right, thank you all for that discussion. So we have 20 minutes or so left. Are there more comments on the hazard mitigation plan? I have one if nobody else. So one of the things I was surprised by was that the Natural Resources Department was not given ownership of any of the strategy or strategic recommendations. And I wasn't sure why they were not included, or if they came under the umbrella of another department. Or
Going back to the hazard mitigation plan being a live document, it's not static. The priorities section that you see in the hazard mitigation plan has been significantly altered. That's one of the first things I did, was to identify what departments were owners of particular strategies. So there are multiple. There are multiple departments that are involved with a lot of these different strategies, not just one, not just two. Some instances there's 5. Some instances there's just 1. So actually Natural Resources is included.
Okay.
I don't have anything that is available for the general public at the moment to put on the website, but that is the goal. Internally, I have color-coded that document because I'm a color-coded type of person. That way it's clear on, what's been completed, what hasn't, who's in charge of that particular. So Natural Resources was included, yes.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. Do we have any comment from the public regarding the hazard mitigation plan and the progress on the 59 strategic goals for that? Nope. Okay, thank you. Any other public comment from those that are here? Yes, Liz. Will you come up to a mic, please, and introduce yourself?
Liz Trillios, Tom Evers. I did mention to a couple.
I'm sorry, Liz, we can't hear you, so really close to the mic. It's on.
I did mention to a couple of people that I think it's important that you get more information out to the public about who you
Can't hear
are.
anything.
And
Yeah,
what
Gary,
you're
hang on.
doing.
Can't hear anything.
Yeah,
The mic's not on.
It is-
it sounds like it's on, but come up to one of these mics, Liz. No, we need to record you.
Liz Trillios.
Oh, there we go, thank you.
I mentioned to a couple of people that I think it's important that you get some information about who you are and what you're doing to the public. And I do think if you can get a sheet out that can be presented and given out at town meeting so people get some idea about what you're doing, because most people don't have any idea. And I've been sitting in on all of these. And I'm very impressed, and I think you're doing a wonderful and thoughtful job. And people should know about it, so then when it comes to really make your presence known and what you're doing, they can be helpful.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, one comment I had from a fellow select board member was that the time is difficult for people to make since we're doing it. So midday, early afternoon, and if we could, have, and I think we'll still have the same people. If we did it at 6 to 8 at night, I don't think it would change myself, but that was a comment.
Well, I think Liz's suggestion is a very good one.
I think as the chair of the education committee, I think I hadn't thought about town meeting specifically. We hadn't talked about it, so that might be a good target because usually there's materials outside of town meeting from various town boards. So I think is that an appropriate spot to have some information about the?
I'll wear the sandwich board to draw attention.
You'll have to get HGC approval for that sandwich board.
The
It
other
would
thing,
have to be a something natural sandwich, I bet.
There you go. You can't do that.
just remember, town meeting doesn't include some of those people that, in the summer community that
Right.
don't live here, don't vote. But the other thing we might think about is a letter to the editor in some way. Maybe Mary just writing a letter to the editor, just advising what we're doing or something, or getting
Vince
a
could
newspaper
probably,
an
yeah.
interview or something
Yeah.
like that.
Vince and I were interviewed on Town Talk, and we shared that link out. And is that link on the library page?
No, it's not, but I can
Yeah.
put it there.
Yeah. But I think that if Vince wanted to write a letter from the Department of Natural Resources to the INM saying these meetings happen and the public is welcome, that might be a good way to do that.
So I was one of the panelists at the Rotary's Coastal Resilience Forum that they had, and one of the audience members at the end asked the question, has the Inquirer and Mirror been supportive of the activities of the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee? And I think I was the one who fielded that question, and I just said that we haven't had a representative at our meetings, but not to say that someone doesn't watch or look at the minutes later. So I think just because we haven't done anything major, I guess that's why there hasn't been coverage. So I think it would be nice. There is interest from the public, and I appreciate what Liz said. So maybe from a couple of different angles, getting the word out there. So some of the things that we talked about in the Ed Committee, and we could just kind of fast track some of it to get something out for town meeting. Obviously, we're going to be targeting the summer community as the season comes, and then the more we get in the paper, the better. So I think if we could do a lot of different things, then.
Yeah. Also, one of the ways Inky doesn't cover the Harbor and Shellfish Advisory Board meetings because they are the first and third Tuesdays of every month, and at 5 p.m. that's when school committee meets. So they put their reporters there, and they never cover us. So one way we get the word out is by posting our minutes on a Facebook page, which I created, and having a little announcement, at the top saying, we talked about these things, and here are our minutes, and please attend our meetings, and at least you're putting it out there. And sometimes you get people talking about it, and then you can go on there and answer people's questions, and at least it's out there.
Just to also say that Natural Resources Department has quite an active Facebook page and Instagram, more than 1,000 followers on each. I have my assigned day, as everyone in our department does, to put stuff online. We just post once a day, not to overdo it. So I have that outlet that I regularly use to put up information about this committee and other activities within the department. I also have contact information separately with a member of the Inky, with one of the reporters there. He comes down to our department regularly to find out information about CONCOM and other decisions. I could talk to him about maybe doing something. It's also worthwhile pointing out that the town has a public outreach coordinator, Florencia, and we can coordinate with her in getting more public engagement for this committee.
So all good ideas. Thank you, Liz, for bringing that topic up.
Yeah, I don't get all that worried about it. I mean, when it's time, I think they'll be engaged. It's great to try to engage people, but we were raising, I'm going back again, we were raising money for the Delta Fields way back, and we'd raised like 50 grand, and then, it would sort of trickle in and slow down, and you needed more. And the only time it happened, we would say, oh, well, we aren't going to be able to build them. And then everyone would give more money again, and so it's the same thing. Unless there's something that's immediately going to impact people, they aren't likely to pay much attention. Only when they know that, okay, something's going to impact me, or geez, then they'll come. And so I think when we start talking about some of the more contentious parts of this, I think we'll see people coming. Right now, we're waiting for something. Waiting for a report, and we're sort of building our base. And I think we'll have more people when we start actually having real conversations about zoning, or you'll have to move your house, or the roads will have to be higher, or whatever. I think you'll see a lot more interest.
Yeah, Holly?
I wanted to just let the committee know about our kickoff for the Resilient Nantucket. You were there, Vince was there. So that happened last Friday with our consultants. They unfortunately weren't physically here, but they were able to do a PowerPoint presentation in this room with quite a few stakeholders for the town. We're going to have our public hearings, public forum meetings, and that's going to start in March. We're going to have a community forum and a FEMA workshop, which will be in March 26th. Then we're going to have a design guidelines charrette, which is what planners love to talk about, and that'll be May 28th. And then in between May and June, we're going to have another community forum. That time is to be determined, but we're probably going to be piggybacking on a HDC meeting. And then we're going to have our formal kickoff, our final presentation of the design guidelines June 26th, which is going to be the last day of the Nantucket Preservation Trust's summer symposium that they do every year. They've graciously allowed us to piggyback on that. I just want to let you all know, because you all are part of it. This is the start of resiliency in Nantucket. I think it's important. We are a National Historic Landmark. That says a lot under the federal law, so much so that the National Park Service just came out in November with design guidelines that basically do a pros and cons with the Secretary of the Interior standards. So that's very important for NHL, and it's getting the conversation started. So I'd love to see if anybody can attend. I'll have more information out there. It'll be available on the town's website through our public outreach coordinator, Florencia. She'll be helping me with that. But yeah, it's a start, and I'm very excited.
Thank you, Holly. And congratulations. Right, other business from the committee? No? Okay, our next meeting is March 3rd?
Great.
Our next meeting, March 3rd, 10:45 in this room. And again, just a reminder to everyone, if you have suggestions for speakers, for topics, for anything that you want to have included on the agenda, let Vince know. He and I plan the agendas out pretty quickly following one meeting for the next. So if nothing else, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor, we need to count off for Gary. Fritz?
Aye.
Gary's aye. All right, I like how you're right first on the list there, Gary. Thank you.
Well, I couldn't hear about half the meeting because those mics aren't working very well.
Golding, aye.
Mary Longacre, aye.
Jen Carberg, aye.
I made the motion, so.
You still have to, still have to vote.
Sarah Boyce, aye.
Peter Brace, aye.
And the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.